Welcome. In today's webinar, which was produced in collaboration with the Department of English Language Learners and Student Supports for the New York City Department of Education, we'll be focusing on the fundamentals of advanced literacy instruction from the perspective of school leaders and their teams. For viewers who would like additional information beyond that which is provided in this webinar, please see our companion text. Specifically, in our companion text and in today's webinar, we outline 4 key shifts that leaders and their teams might make at a school site to move towards a model in which advanced literacies are taught each and every day in all classrooms. The first of these key shifts involves moving from a model in which we seek to support diverse learners through interventions alone to a model where we focus on strengthening the instructional core so that the majority of learners' needs are met in the classroom rather than through a series of cumbersome interventions. The second key shift involves placing data at the core of our literacy improvement effort so that the instruction that we are providing is closely aligned with student strengths and challenges identified through assessment. The third key shift involves moving to a model of shared curriculum to support day-to-day teaching and learning, so that our practitioners are no longer responsible for designing and delivering instruction, and instead squarely focused on instructional delivery. The fourth key shift involves moving to a model of 21st century adult learning, in which the professional development priorities that we establish are closely aligned with student needs identified through our data collection. This is a drastic shift from one-size-fits-all professional development models. In this webinar, I'll be focusing on Key Shift 2, which we find is one of the greatest priorities at many of the schools with which we have worked. And this key shift involves moving data from the edges of our instructional improvement efforts to the very core, so that everything we are doing day to day is aligned with the priorities for student learning identified through the data we've collected. A number of 21st century realities impact Key Shift 2. The first of these is that while it is a common practice at many schools to use state assessment data to understand the growth of individual learners, this data is most soundly used to understand population-level trends and patterns in student performance and to evaluate the quality of our programs. The second of these 21st century realities is that while assessment data that surfaces student difficulties is often interpreted to signal the need for interventions, we suggest that this instead implies the need to focus on adjusting the instructional core. And finally, because many assessments tap literacy performances rather than component skills, the data is simply not specific enough to match student needs to interventions. Let's unpack this third 21st century reality further. Frequently, students are asked to engage in these tasks on literacy assessments: to find the main idea, to make a prediction, to summarize the text, and to make an inference. These are literacy performances that involve a series of literacy skills. For example, to accurately find a main idea, make a prediction, or generate a summary, students must have this plethora of literacy skills. They must be able to read the words on the page, which involves understanding the sounds that letters make, a facet of phonological awareness. They must have adequate background knowledge of the topic, interest, motivation, an understanding of the purpose, knowledge of various text characteristics, the organizational structure and sentence structure of the text, as well as a series of oral language skills, including vocabulary knowledge. While an assessment might tap those skills in the center circle, intervention and support for students in our classrooms would involve building the skills that surround this circle, and essentially those skills that go into each of these so-called literacy performances. So when we assess reading to identify the various component skills that support a literacy performance, what are we assessing? Well, we are assessing code-based skills, which are the skills that support students to read the words on a page. For example, whether a student has knowledge of the sounds that letters make and is able to blend these sounds together to read words. In addition, a number of other skills, including the ability to read words fluently across a text, are associated with code-based skills. The second and much larger bucket of skills that we might assess when we assess what we refer to as reading are meaning-based skills. And this involves conceptual knowledge about the world, knowledge about language, including vocabulary, syntax, sentence structures, and text structures. Motivation and understanding of the purpose for reading are also meaning-based skills. We differentiate between these two skill sets, code and meaning-based skills, that together comprise reading, because they have different developmental processes which have important instructional implications. So let me begin by talking about this in the domain of code-based skills. Code-based skills are typically mastered by third grade because they represent a constrained mastery-oriented domain. Once a student has mastered the 44 sounds that comprise the English language, they're able to read any word on any written page in any text that they encounter. In contrast, meaning-based skills develop from infancy through adulthood, and they are unconstrained, meaning that they are never mastered. For example, each of us continues to learn new words and new pieces of knowledge that inform our understanding of text each and every day. These differences have important implications for instruction. First, code-based skills are highly susceptible to instruction in a relatively brief period of time. Estimates suggest that teaching code-based skills 20 minutes a day from kindergarten through second grade should lead to mastery in this domain. In contrast, meaning-based skills require sustained instruction, which begins in early childhood and progresses through adolescence. In fact, in our classrooms, in the middle school and beyond, we are still very much teaching meaning-based skills. What is the implication of this for assessment? Well, the implication is that we are testing both of these domains of skill to understand if our students are skilled and proficient readers. In other words, an effective assessment system provides data that is usable. So, an assessment approach will give us information on students' literacy achievement in separate teachable domains. For example, in the domain of code-based and reading-based skills, we need to understand how our students are performing. Assessments are really only worth administering if the data will be used to inform instruction. And so we want to think of daily assessment as part of teaching and learning, something that helps us to teach our students day to day. An effective assessment system is highly efficient. So a good battery minimizes time on testing and maximizes time on instruction. An effective assessment system is also feasible. So schools need a clear, feasible schedule for assessment. And finally, our use of assessment data needs to be informed. So it is not that the results themselves of assessment are positive or negative, accurate or inaccurate. It is instead how we interpret and use this data that makes them positive or negative. In many of our schools today, however, we face a number of leadership issues that we must overcome if we are to implement effective assessment systems. The first leadership issue that we encounter at many school sites is that too much time is spent on assessment, and much less time is allocated for analysis. In other words, we're spending the majority of our time on administering assessments rather than using the data that we collect. In addition, we see that there is much overlap in the assessments that students are given, with code-based and meaning-based skills being tapped by multiple assessment measures that students are taking, resulting in broad overlap in the skills that we are testing. The solution to this is to revisit assessment systems that are currently being used, to eliminate redundancies, and to increase the use of brief screeners so that we are not testing multiple skills using different measures. The second leadership issue, which is connected to data use, is that in many schools with which we have worked, data is not easily accessible for review and analysis. The result is that in many school sites, leaders and their teams don't actually look that closely at data to inform strategic planning. And because sites can't look at progress on different assessments, they're unable to compare performances over time. To remedy this, we suggest that at school sites, a site-level database be created that allows for ongoing and efficient data analysis. The third leadership issue is related to the instructional and assessment links that exist at school sites. Often, there is no clear link between data gathering and instructional outcomes. So educators have many questions about which skills to target for improvement. For example, whether students are studying in the domain of code-based skills, meaning-based skills, or both. And often, the assessments that we use in our classrooms assess both of these skill sets simultaneously. For example, asking students to read a text and write a summary, giving us little insight into whether that poor summary writing skill that a student demonstrates is the result of not having code-based skills or meaning-based skills. This suggests that we need assessments that more clearly map to the instruction that we will be providing, giving us insight into whether students have achieved mastery of code-based and meaning-based skills. A second area where this leadership issue is relevant is in relation to special education services and interventions and supports that are often ineffective. We are often choosing interventions to target an entire population of readers in the needs improvement band that are not specific enough to support their issues with code-based or meaning-based skills. This suggests that we need to link more carefully our interventions with the sorts of skills that students actually need support to develop. So we suggest that you use a decision tree to link aggregated patterns in student data to instructional planning, a concept that I will discuss in greater detail in just a moment. So one method for overcoming many of these leadership issues is to take a systematic approach in how we use data, whether we use that data to inform the improvement of the instructional core or to inform the placement of students in additional supplementary interventions. Starting at the beginning of the decision tree, to begin to understand if a student's issues are indicative of a larger population level pattern or, in fact, related to an individual difficulty, we ask an important question. And that question is this student's problem unusual given peers' performance? If the answer is no, this suggests that rather than referring this student to intervention, we should be thinking about adapting the instructional core to support this learner and others like him or her that are experiencing the same difficulties. If our answer to this first question is yes, this suggests that this student should be placed into some sort of intervention that will target the specific skills and weaknesses that the student needs support to develop. For instance, if our assessments surface a difficulty with code-based skills, we might refer this student to additional phonics instruction. However, if this instruction flags a student as experiencing difficulties with meaning-based skills that are unlike peers, our challenge will be to provide additional support for those skills while also preserving the student's interaction with meaningful instruction that builds vocabulary and concept knowledge within the context of the classroom. By following the decision tree, we not only can make decisions about when we should focus our attention on the core and when we should think about intervention, we can also systematically plan our intervention for students. By following the right side of the decision tree, you will note that you are led through the process of decision-making around student supports. However, how do you get to the decision tree? What sort of comprehensive assessment system needs to be in place so that we are able to answer the first question that kicks off our decision tree analysis. The first step in getting to the decision tree involves the design of a comprehensive assessment system. There are a number of principles that should be kept in mind as leaders and their teams begin the redesign of existing assessment systems. The first principle to keep in mind is that different assessment tools have different capabilities and serve different purposes. We therefore need to understand the relationship between the type and the function of the assessment. We also need to understand how the scores of assessment should be interpreted. We must also keep in mind that no single assessment is sufficient to screen for early difficulties or to monitor for progress. Therefore, we need measurements across different areas to fully gauge student progress and to identify those within our population who might be struggling in ways that are different from peers. This involves adopting a new perspective on student assessment. While in classrooms, we have traditionally followed the paradigm of following up with struggling students without screening all of the students in our population for difficulties, we advocate for a different approach, and that is to screen all students for literacy difficulties, therefore identifying those within the population who might have particular needs that are distinct from their peers. It's often the case that the old paradigm, in which we followed up with students that were identified by teachers as struggling, overlooked those within our population who were struggling in ways that were more subtle or were not as easily identified. By screening all students, we remove that potential source of error from the assessment equation. Let's return to that first principle of strong assessment, and that is understanding the key assessment types that are part of a strong and efficacious assessment system. The first of those assessment types is the formative or diagnostic assessment. These are assessments that are strongly tied to curriculum and daily instruction. They are largely driven by teacher observation. And although these can sometimes be formal measures, they are just as often informal measures that are administered by teachers during day-to-day instruction. Examples of formative and diagnostic assessments include the Diagnostic Reading Inventory and the Fontes and Pinnell benchmarks, which are examples of formative diagnostic assessments. But quizzes and informal check-ins that teachers conduct as part of daily instruction are also part of a formative battery. We advise that because these measures are strongly aligned with day-to-day instruction, that they be used solely to inform instruction. The second bucket of assessments that are part of a strong assessment system are screening assessments. These are quick assessments that provide a reference point for student performance outside of the curriculum and outside of the school population. For example, the DIBELS is a measure of code-based skills that can be quickly administered to students in the population and provides information about how students within the school are performing on code-based skills when compared to schools nationally. The third bucket of assessment types that we include in a strong assessment system are outcome measures. These are normative assessments that are given once or twice a year. These may include a state ELA test, the SAT 10, or English proficiency test, for example, the WIDA. Now, one test type is not part of a formal assessment system, and these are test prep assessments. These intend to mimic state assessments and provide a sense of how students will perform at the end of the year. However, we believe that these are not part of a data-driven instructional design process. They are primarily based on a shifting criteria. From year to year, state assessments differ quite a bit, and so the ability of these assessments to accurately predict how a student will perform has been shown to be very poor. We suggest that these are not a good use of our instructional time or dollars. So multiple questions arise in how we use these three assessment types within a screening system. Formative and diagnostic measures are given on an ongoing basis as needed to calibrate instruction, and the timing is dictated by teachers. Therefore, we are strongly against the practice of mandating that the Fontes and Pinnell benchmarks or any measure that is tied to instruction is mandated to be given during a certain time frame within the school year. Instead, teachers should be making decisions about when to administer these measures to inform their instruction. In relation to screening measures, timing is dictated by the school. For example, code-based and meaning-based screening measures are often administered at the start and the end of the school year as a periodic check-in on student mastery against students nationally. And finally, the third assessment type within our battery are outcome assessments. The timing of these assessments is dictated by the district or the state, and these provide an annual summative assessment of student achievement in broad content areas and domains. This gives us less information about the learners in our classrooms and more information about how we are doing as a school in meeting state standards set externally. Together, these three types of assessment comprise a comprehensive assessment system. If you are viewing this webinar with a small group, I invite you to take a moment to turn and talk and consider these two questions. How does this information change your prior understandings and potentially your practices around assessment at your school site? And what questions do you have? Let's take a moment to return to a prototypical school, like many schools with which we have worked, the Rosa Parks. What you see on this slide is their battery when we began work with them. They had in place a number of formative and diagnostic assessments that were administered on a school-mandated calendar by the classroom teacher, often 2 times per year. These included lengthy testing of all students using informal reading inventories, something that took teachers nearly 3 weeks into the start of the school year. No screening measures were administered, meaning that the Rosa Parks lacked a lot of necessary information about how students were performing in code-based and meaning-based skills when compared to students nationally. Often, they were very surprised with how students performed on outcome assessments by the state. Because there had been no previous assessment of students using a screener, the performance on outcome assessments was often quite shocking because it was the first time that learners within the school were compared to students elsewhere. So what are the limitations of the current Rosa Parks battery? Well, in the domain of code-based skills, there was no screener. They were using formative measures as a screener. There was also limited formative data collected on code-based skills. In addition, in the domain of meaning-based skills, there was no screener and limited formative assessment, with comprehension questions on an informal reading inventory serving to inform their understanding of students' meaning-based skills. The question often arises when we present this existing assessment battery as to why a formative measure, such as a benchmark assessment, cannot be used as a screener. Well, there are a few reasons. The first reason is that students are reading at their instructional level, and the observations and judgments are tied to that text. Because these assessments are administered by individual raters who often use different criteria, we cannot compare performance from student to student or aggregate the data to identify trends and patterns across children and classrooms. That data is only useful within a single classroom in relation to that teacher's instruction. It is often the case that when we have discussed this with educators in the room, they reflect on the many times that a reading level arrived at by a colleague differed drastically from their own assessment of that student's skills. Furthermore, we cannot identify potential breakdowns that students are experiencing when accessing complex grade level text because the assessment is done at students' instructional level, not at grade level. So let's take a moment to compare a formative assessment text to the sort of text that would appear on a screener. If you review this text, taken from a common formative assessment, you will notice that the tone is very conversational. The vocabulary is very familiar. Most students have awareness of the language used in the text before even entering school. There are simple reference chains, so these bubbles refers to they in the next sentence, and this is a relatively simple syntactic construction. There is also little information in each sentence, which makes them easy for readers to process. Now let's turn to this screener. If you're looking at this text, you'll notice that it's quite different from the previous text. While the prior text is at a student's instructional level, this text is at grade level. You'll note that the tone is much less conversational. There is certainly unfamiliar vocabulary and the use of words that have multiple meanings. There are chains of reference that are quite complicated, requiring that a student track ideas across multiple sentences. And finally, there are multiple ideas that require a complex mental schema, including an understanding of beaches, sandcastle building, and waves. Another question that often arises when we discuss the design of assessment systems is why an outcome-based assessment, for example, a state standardized assessment measure, cannot be used to inform instruction. The primary reason is that these assessments are meant to provide a global, aggregate level picture of the student population. So, for example, they give us information about the degree to which a school's reading program is meeting students' needs, or if certain groups appear to be responding to instruction more so than others. For example, whether English language learners are performing at a level commensurate to peers within the school. If we use item-level data to design instruction, then we are simply teaching performances, for example, how to summarize. But we are not addressing those underlying skills or competencies, for example, code-based and meaning-based skills, that will carry the reader through the years. And we are not likely targeting the main source of the breakdown, which is in a code-based or meaning-based skill, not in a composite performance in which we use many code-based and meaning-based skills simultaneously. Now that we've concluded our discussion of assessment types and functions, let's turn to the second piece of engaging with Key Shift 2, and that's the creation of a data system that makes scores clear and accessible. The first step in creating a data system that makes scores clear and accessible begins with communicating to all in the school community when data will be collected. This is an example timeline that shows how one school systematically planned to implement screening assessments in September, December, and then in March. An important thing to think about in terms of a streamlined assessment system is the amount of time that we spend on assessment. Generally, we think of assessing code-based skills 3 times per year using a screening measure, September, December, and March, for no more than 5 hours per class per administration, for a total of 20 hours of class-wide assessment. Because these measures are individually administered, we would allocate 5 hours total to this assessment in a single classroom. Meaning-based skills, on the other hand, should be assessed during 2 assessment periods, September and February, for no more than 1 hour per administration. The majority of these assessments are group administered, and so we are talking about really 6 hours total of meaning-based assessment that should be done for screening purposes in a single classroom. This is a drastic reduction in the typical amount of time spent on assessment in the average American school. To conclude this webinar, I'd like to leave you with a few action steps for those of you who are considering working on Key Shift 2. The first of those is that your team should work together to understand the 3 assessment types and how they work together. The second action that you should take as a leadership team is to conduct an assessment inventory, which involves examining the current assessments given at your school site, to identify how much time is spent and which sub-skills are currently being assessed. A third step that you should take if you're planning on working on Key Shift 2 is to plan an assessment system that is comprehensive and streamlined. We offered a few examples in this webinar, but additional discussion of this topic is provided in our companion text. Finally, for those teams planning on working on Key Shift 2, we suggest that you create a data recording system that makes data accessible and clear to all educators at a school site and allows for this data to be easily translated into practice. For those of you who would like to begin working on Key Shift 2 at the conclusion of this webinar, we suggest that you make use of the leadership tools available in Chapter 5 of our companion text. Thank you for your time and attention. I've enjoyed sharing this webinar with you.